Thank you for logging on. I'm Jonah Cohen, Camera's Communications Director. In today's Camera webinar, we're asking the Nakba narrative, is it a fact or is it fictional? Supporters say it's not only factual, but also the chief crime at the basis of the creation of the Jewish state. Efforts are now underway to enshrine this Nakba narrative, not only in academia, but even in the United States government. Last month, as you're probably aware, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib introduced a resolution to recognize the Palestinian Nakba. The motion described the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, as, quote, Israel's uprooting, dispossession, and exile of the Palestinian people from their homeland, end quote. The proposal went on to say, quote, a just and lasting peace cannot be established without addressing the Nakba and remedying its injustices toward the Palestinian people, end quote. And the proposal added that the Nakba is the root cause of the issues that divide Israelis and Palestinians. So the story of the Nakba is important in current debates about the Israeli-Arab conflict. But is there good historical evidence for it? Is there good moral evidence for this narrative that casts Israel as the villain in the story? Tlaib and her followers obviously say there absolutely is. Well, arguing against that point of view is Dr. Alex Safian, Camera's research director. He recently published an article at our website, camera.org, entitled "The Nakba Narrative is Nonsense." It triggered a ton of social media engagement. In fact, I believe it was our most successful article, our most organically shared and commented upon article on social media. It really went viral and seems to have spoken to a lot of people. So we thought it would be a good idea to have Dr. Safian do a webinar about his piece where you, our viewers, could post questions and feedback. He'll speak now for about 20 minutes, then we'll go to Q&A. If you run your cursor at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. Click there, type your questions while he speaks. Now about 600 people have registered for this webinar, so we probably won't be able to get to most of your questions and comments, but please know that we will read and consider everything you write in. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts, so don't be shy. And with that, it's my privilege to turn this over to Dr. Safian.
Thanks very much, Jonah. Indeed, I agree with your introduction. The Nakba narrative is an inversion of history portraying the victims of Arab aggression as the perpetrators and initiators of aggression, portraying self-defense against Arab attacks as a brutal assault on the Arabs. Nakba means catastrophe, and there was a catastrophe for Palestinians in and after 1948, but it was mostly self-inflicted, including their spurning of many opportunities for a Palestinian state. The Nakba narrative, the charge that Israel was born in original sin and like the fruit of the poison tree is simply bad, is key to much of what we are seeing today. I agree with Rashida Tlaib in that way. This is true at Amnesty International, at Human Rights Watch, on college campuses, among so-called progressives, including movements like the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and politicians who identify with the DSA, like Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and of course AOC. Today's Nakba narrative really began in the 1950s, when the Soviet Union used writers with Jewish-sounding names to write propaganda pamphlets and articles, sorry about that, calling Israel imperialist, racist, colonialist, Nazi-like, etc., the usual Soviet criticism of their enemies, and very similar to the criticism of Israel that we still see today. The Arab oil weapon was unleashed after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and as a direct result, 2 years later came UN Resolution 3379, that Zionism is racism. The process continued significantly with the UN-sponsored Durban Conference in 2001, just a few days after 9/11, supposedly against racism, but essentially equating Zionism with racism, which began the Durban process of accelerating delegitimization of Israel. Israel's supposed original sin is the key to the anti-Israel movement, and that makes debunking and exposing the false narrative absolutely crucial. So let's start rolling back the false Nakba narrative right now. Did Israel plan to and actually expel and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians? Well, as early as 1937, in a letter to his son, David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, wrote, "We do not wish and do not need to expel Arabs and take their places. All our aspiration is built on the assumption, proven throughout all our activity, that there is enough room in the country for ourselves and the Arabs." And let me just pause to note that this letter, this particular paragraph in this letter, has been widely mangled, saying that we need to expel the Arabs. This is not what David Ben-Gurion said. Ephraim Karsh, Israeli and British historian, went to the archives and looked at the actual letter and saw how much this letter had been mangled and falsified by the anti-Israel activists. Now, 10 years later, even after much violence and conflict, Ben-Gurion's core beliefs about living in peace with the Arabs had not wavered. This is what he said in his speech on December 13, 1947. "In our state, there will be non-Jews as well, and all of them will be equal citizens, equal in everything without exception. The attitude of the Jewish state to its Arab citizens will be an important factor, though not the only one, in building good neighborly relations with the Arab states. Despite the Jewish community's attempts to live peacefully with their neighbors, the primary leader of the Palestinians, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, chose to make common cause with the Nazis, declaring through his spokesman that the Arabs' goal was the elimination of the Jewish state. The Mufti spent much of World War II in Nazi Germany, where he urged the accelerated extermination of the Jews in meetings with Hitler and Himmler, prevented the rescue of tens of thousands of Jews when rescue was still possible, helped organize Bosnian Muslim SS units that committed grave war crimes against Serbian Christians and Jews, and made numerous pro-Nazi propaganda broadcasts to the Arab world. For example, in a broadcast from Germany on March 1st, 1944, the Mufti urged Arabs everywhere to commit genocide against the Jews. "Rise as one and fight for your sacred rights," he said. "Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God and history. This serves your honor. God is with you." After the war, Husseini was indicted by Yugoslavia for war crimes, but escaped prosecution by fleeing to Egypt, which gave him sanctuary. The Mufti's actions directly implicated the Palestinian movement, which he headed, in the Holocaust. But the Jews still tried to reach an accommodation with their Arab neighbors. When the UN finally voted to partition the Palestine Mandate territory into Jewish and Palestinian states, the Jews accepted with disappointment at how little land they would get, but the Palestinians and their Arab allies outright rejected Resolution 181 and vowed to invade and destroy the Jewish state the moment the British troops left. The Arabs thought they would easily slaughter the accursed Jews, but when faced with much tougher than expected resistance and even battlefield losses, Palestinians began to panic, leading to the Palestinian refugee problem that is still with us today. Now, the largest number of Palestinian refugees, about 10% of the total, were from the mixed city of Haifa, and what happened there was indicative. The Palestinians of Haifa were not expelled. On the contrary, as Benny Morris, the revisionist historian, documented, the Palestinians who fled Haifa did so against pleas from their Jewish neighbors and a British general that they stay put. This is what Morris wrote. Under British mediation, the Israeli leadership agreed to a ceasefire, offering what the British regarded as generous terms. But then, when faced with Muslim pressure, the largely Christian leadership got cold feet. A ceasefire meant surrender and implied readiness to live under Jewish rule. That would open them to charges of collaboration and treachery. So, to the astonishment of the British and the Jewish military and political leaders gathered on the afternoon of 22 April at Haifa Town Hall, the Arab delegation announced that its community would evacuate the city. The Jewish mayor, Shabtai Levy, and the British commander, Major General Hugh Stockwell, pleaded with the Arabs to reconsider, but the Arabs were unmoved. A few days later, the Histadrut, the Israeli labor union, published its own appeal to the Arab residents of Haifa. Do not destroy your homes and lose your sources of income and bring upon yourselves disaster by evacuation. They could have said catastrophe. The Haifa Workers' Council and the Histadrut advise you for your own good to stay and return to your regular work. Had the Palestinians accepted partition, the Palestinian state would have been created side by side with Israel in 1948, and there wouldn't have been a single Palestinian refugee. How then can Israel be blamed for the Palestinian refugee problem? Instead, they chose war, a war in which fully 1% of the Israeli population was killed, which is a huge toll. In US terms today, that would be a war in which more than 3 million of our people were killed. So who stands accused of being bad, of being born in original sin, Zionism or the Palestinian national movement? Of course, there's much more to be said on these topics, but I'll stop here and refer you to the recent Nakba article on the camera site for some of those details, and we'll continue with questions that Jonah will present.
Thank you, Alex. As I mentioned at the start, your article was widely shared on social media and elicited a ton of engagement. Almost all of it was positive, but it also brought out a lot of online haters and trolls, which is evidence, I think, that your article touched a nerve. So I thought we could begin by getting your responses to some of those typical critical responses that we received online. For example, a common theme or slogan we received is that your article is Nakba denial, and should be compared to Holocaust denial. What do you make of that? Is challenging the Nakba narrative analogous to Holocaust denial?
No, because as I've said, the Nakba did happen, was a catastrophe for the Palestinians, but it was a self-inflicted Palestinian catastrophe on the Palestinians. So I'm not denying the catastrophe that the Palestinians suffered. What I am denying is that Israel was responsible for that catastrophe. So there's no similarity. Furthermore, to even compare whatever the Palestinians claim happened in the Nakba to the Holocaust, of course, is obscene and is equivalent to a Holocaust denial or less minimization. It's ridiculous to compare the Palestinians, whose population, never decreased and is one of the fastest growing populations in the world, even today, with the Holocaust, in which 1/3 of the world's Jews were murdered in just a relatively short period of time. Show me the death camps of the Palestinians. There were none, right? There was no Holocaust. The Jews had their hand out in peace all the while, and the Palestinians and the Arabs kept on slapping it aside in order to engage in a war, which they thought they would win easily. So there's absolutely no comparison between the Holocaust and the Nakba, and there's no comparison between questioning the false Palestinian narrative of the Nakba and Holocaust denial. There's no relationship whatsoever. It's ridiculous.
I guess following on from that other challenges, other people are posting online that the article was somehow racist, or that it's racist to claim to challenge the Nakba narrative. What is your response to that? Is it racist to question this storyline?
Well, saying doesn't make it so. And one of the primary charges that people use these days to try to shut other people up is claiming that they're racist. I really fail to see the logic that denying the story that Palestinians tell, the false story that Palestinians tell about what happened in 1948 and afterwards, is racist. I don't see how. What has race got to do with it? There are some Palestinians who will deny the claims of the Nakba as well. We've seen Palestinians deny some of the specific claims, like, for instance, of a massacre at Deir Yassin. There are Palestinians who were there who say, no, it didn't happen. We've seen that testimony. So, no, I don't think it's racist in any sense to deny the reality of the Nakba narrative and to point out its falsehoods. That's not racist, right?
Right.
Facts are stubborn things, as the saying goes, and they have nothing to do with race.
Right. Another key component of this narrative is the claim that Israel was built on top of 400 to 500 Arab villages, which were ethnically cleansed to make way for the Jewish state. Can you tell us about that claim? Where did it come from? Is it true? What's the story behind it?
Yeah, there's one of the places it comes from is a book by Walid Khalidi, the late Walid Khalidi, who was the uncle of Rashid Khalidi, the, I guess, Columbia at this point professor. I think he holds the Edward Said Chair, if I'm not mistaken, which I don't think I'd be proud of if I held it. But Walid Khalidi wrote a book, an encyclopedic book called All That Remains, about what allegedly happened to Palestinian villages. However, Israeli geographers who have gone through it have said that there are vast mistakes and exaggerations. Some of the villages which he claims were depopulated by Israel were villages that had not been inhabited for 100 years at that point. They were basically abandoned Palestinian villages. Many of the others, of course, there was no expulsion. As I indicated, Haifa was the largest movement or creator of Palestinian refugees. The departure of Palestinians from Haifa was the largest single contribution to the Palestinian refugee problem. And in that case, the Jews begged them to stay, and the British begged them to stay, and they refused. One of the things I didn't mention in my article was a similar situation in Jaffa, which is very interesting. Jaffa, of course, is near Tel Aviv. At that time was an independent community. Now it's part of the Tel Aviv municipality. It's Tel Aviv Jaffa municipality. In that case, again, there was fighting. There were Arab refugees from Jaffa, but there were also Jewish refugees from parts of Jaffa where Jews lived. So there were both Arab and Jewish refugees. The topography greatly favored the Jews because Tel Aviv was right there. There was a large concentration of Jews in that area, so it did not favor the Jaffa, which was basically had its backs against the sea. So in that case, under British suggestion or pressure, the Jews offered a compromise. They offered a ceasefire to the Arabs of Jaffa. And the conditions were, again, according to the British, very, very generous. Basically, stop fighting, ceasefire, and return of refugees on both sides. The Arab refugees can go back to Jaffa, who left, and the Jewish refugees can go back to their homes in and near Jaffa. And the Arabs of Jaffa wanted to accept because it was a very reasonable proposal, and they saw what the handwriting was on the wall, that if continued fighting, it wouldn't go well for them. But they had to send a messenger to Cairo to ask the leader of the Palestinian movement, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti. So they sent a messenger to Cairo to ask him, and he absolutely forbade them from agreeing to this. And so the net effect of it is that many of the residents of Haifa then fled and asked the British to help set up ships who would leave by sea. Many of them went to Lebanon. It's interesting that one of the major Palestinian American historians, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, actually wrote about this. He was from Jaffa. He was a young man who fled from Jaffa, and he wrote about it. And it's very interesting what he said. As he was boarding one of the ships with his friends who were the same age, military age, young men, same as him, there was a young sailor on board the ship, Christian, not Arab, not Jewish, just on this leased ship that was going to take him and his family and his friends to Lebanon. And the sailor looked at him and said, "Why are you leaving? Why don't you stay and fight?" And Ibrahim Abu Lughod said that he will never forget that sailor's face. And since then, from that day on, he has never had a good answer to what that sailor asked him. Why don't you stay and fight? He has never had a good answer. And this is not from a Zionist. This is from a very, very pro-Palestinian historian, academic, the late Ibrahim Abu Lughod. So there's no question that there was not an expulsion. The only major expulsion that happened, and I mentioned it in the article, and I've written about it further elsewhere, it was from Lydda and Ramla. I don't know if we'll have time to go into that, but that was a situation very briefly in which the Israelis conquered this town, which was a garrison town with Jordanian soldiers and militia members there blocking the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The Israelis conquered the town, and the town surrendered and agreed to give up their weapons and to stop fighting, and they could all live. They could all stay there, right? That was the agreement. It was agreed between the Palestinian Christian and Muslim leaders and the Jewish commander, Moshe Kelman, that they would give up their arms, stop fighting, and everybody could stay, no problem. The Jews then, the Israelis then withdrew their forces. The commander the soldier who actually took the town was a young, relatively unknown commander named Lieutenant Colonel Moshe Dayan, later to become very famous. So he left. His forces had to go with him to Beersheba to deal with the situation there. So the Israelis left very few soldiers in the town. The next day, Jordanian forces did a sort of a reconnaissance to see what was going on near the town, and the Israelis shot at them and drove them off. But the townspeople thought this was the forerunner, this is the early stage of a Jordanian Arab Legion attack to liberate the town from the Jews. And so there was a whole uprising. And the people who had agreed to surrender or give up their weapons still had their weapons and started fighting again against the Jews. And five Israeli soldiers were massacred outside the main mosque and their bodies mutilated. So under very difficult circumstances and outnumbered, the Israelis succeeded in retaking the town. And by the way, the soldier who led that was another relative unknown in those days, later to become very famous, Lieutenant Colonel Yitzhak Rabin, strangely enough. So Rabin led the effort to retake the town, and after a few hours, the town was back in Israeli control. And the question then was what to do with the civilians there in Lydda and Ramla. Lydda is now known as Lod. That's the Hebrew name, but then it was known as Lydda. And Ramla, not to be confused with Ramallah. These were twin towns next to each other, Lydda and Ramla. And the Israelis quite naturally decided that the townspeople had had their chance to surrender and had gone back on their word, and they're not going to give them a second chance to go back on their word. So they said, you have to leave, except for women and children and elderly and some of the Christians. The rest of you had to leave. And so they allowed them to leave. They didn't, shoot at them. They didn't brutalize them, but they said, go, you have to go. And I've never felt, this became later a big scandal in Israel because Yitzhak Rabin included it much later in his autobiography. And the Israeli military censor did not allow him to publish it. It was still very sensitive. I don't know why. What's sensitive about it? I never felt the least bit embarrassed by what happened in Lydda and Ramla. It was perfectly reasonable, and it was humanitarian, really, to allow these people to leave. The Arabs who left were relieved that the Jews didn't do to them what they would have done to the Jews in similar circumstances, which is what they expected. So it got taken out by the Israeli censor, military censor at that point. But the translator of the book into English was a radical, good translator, but a very radical activist named. I thought my phone was off. I don't know why it is still ringing. Radical named Peretz Kidron, who then leaked that passage to the New York Times. So it was a big story in the New York Times, which I think one of the commentators on Twitter.
They kept posting that 1979 article.
So what? It's. I mean, I've written about Lydda and Ramla. It's in this article that I just wrote that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and so it's hardly disproves what we're saying. On the contrary, they had a chance to surrender and to stay there, and they went back on it. So as Abba Eban said long ago, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Here was an opportunity for the residents of Lod and Ramla to stay where they were, and they missed that opportunity. And again, because they were afraid they would be charged with being collaborators, etc. That was part of what into it. So it was the malign influence of the Mufti again, just like in Jaffa.
Yeah, they along with that New York Times article, people were also posting purported testimonials from veterans of the 48 war, claiming to have committed war crimes. What do you make of those testimonials? Are they rebuttals to your thesis, or how do you respond to that?
No, that's all about the story of Tantura, which is a very interesting case. I guess since you've asked it and we have time, I will go into some of the details. Tantura was a Palestinian village, fishing village, and no one ever said a word about Tantura. Walid Khalidi, none of the Palestinians claiming the Nakba ever said a word about Tantura. It was first brought up by an Israeli Jewish graduate student named Teddy Katz, a master's student at Hebrew University. And he went to Tantura and interviewed elderly residents who were there during 1948. And he claimed in his PhD, in his master's thesis, that they had said that there was a terrible massacre, that the Jews took the town and then massacred the residents and the fighters who had surrendered. And his thesis advisor, by the way, was Elon Pape, one of the worst of the radical revisionist historians, denounced by even the other revisionist historians for telling so many lies and for defending the telling of lies. That was his thesis advisor. So his thesis sat on the shelves at Hebrew University until somebody alerted a Ma'ariv. Ma'ariv is an Israeli newspaper, a Ma'ariv reporter, who then wrote a big story about it for the weekend edition, for the weekend magazine, and it became a huge issue, big issue. And the Israeli unit, which had taken Tantura, is called the Alexandroni Brigade. And they were very angry about being charged with committing war crimes because they knew what happened there, and they knew that the veterans knew that this had not happened. And as they said, they were young enough to do something about it. They were old, but they weren't elderly, as the saying would go. They were still functioning. And so they got a lawyer and they filed a lawsuit against Teddy Katz for libeling them and charging them with committing a war crime. And the case went to trial. And of course, as usual, the plaintiffs had discovery in which they could see what evidence Teddy Katz had relied upon for his thesis, including the recordings of his interviews. And lo and behold, when his thesis quoted some Palestinian specific man saying there was a massacre, the recordings showed the opposite. The man said there was no massacre, and that the people who died in the fighting. They were the fighters or the people who were helping the fighters, and they died in the fighting. So Teddy Katz's whole case collapsed and his thesis collapsed. And he agreed to settle the case. And he agreed that he would publish a retraction in Israeli newspapers and an apology. And he would revise his thesis. And so he agreed to all that, because how could he not? I mean, his research was demolished. His research notes indicted him basically as a liar. So about 12 or 18 hours later, he changed his mind after he agreed in court. But the judge said, no, you agreed to this under your own free will. You had your attorney with you. You cannot now go back on your word. So he had to publish the apology and he had to retract his claims. And the university then, I'm not sure now if it was Hebrew University or Haifa University, it's one of those universities, might have been Haifa, said that we are canceling your master's degree, but we'll give you the opportunity to redo your thesis and to make it correct. I don't think he ever succeeded in redoing the thesis and getting his master's. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check since it's been a while. But the bottom line is that the claim about a massacre at Tantura was demolished. Now, it's true that some guy has now done there was actually a play about Tantura, but the playwright, whom I actually debated, did not have the guts to use the word Tantura because he was afraid he would get sued. So he totally fictionalized it, made up a name, but everybody knew it was about Tantura. But he couldn't deal with Teddy Katz's admissions. In fact, I think the name of the play was The Admission, but he couldn't deal with Teddy Katz's admissions and the tape recordings, the Palestinian witnesses who said there was no massacre. Now, somebody has recently or fairly recently done a documentary in which they claim to interview veterans of that fighting, saying that there was a massacre, that they murdered people. I'm not sure that those people were actually veterans of that fighting, or if they were, whether they're still in their right minds. As the veterans said back 20, 30 years ago, at least we're young enough that we can still deal with this. We're not in nursing homes and losing our memories. At this
That's
point,
what they said in court. That was their...
Yeah, back then. Well, not in court, but they said that, I'm glad that if he was going to do this, that he did this while we were still young enough to fight back and to prove that it's not true. If you do a documentary 3 or 4 years ago, it's already too late. These guys are, if they're still alive, are very, very old. So I think that's the situation. There was a court case. Teddy Katz admitted it was untrue. There is documented recordings interviewing Palestinians who lived there at the time who said there was no massacre. How one can try to resurrect a massacre story against all that evidence, I have no idea. But leave it to our enemies to do so, right? Leave it to the activists to try to do so.
So he was a student of Elon Pape. And in fact, on your article, a lot of people were they would just post photos of his book, Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Yes, sure.
So I don't know if you want to expand a bit on your take on Pape's scholarship, on
well,
how
Elon Pape, I've gone through some of his, I forget now some of the details, but there was one case where some journalist quoted something from Pape, which was an alleged passage from Ben-Gurion's diaries. Ben-Gurion's diaries have been published. And I actually checked Ben-Gurion's diaries. We bought Ben-Gurion's diaries and I checked. And there's no such passage. That's not what, I mean, he has the date, right, of the alleged diary entry, etc. It's not there. He just makes things up. Elon Pape once said that the truth is whatever serves progressive politics. Doesn't believe in the truth. He believes in whatever serves progressive politics is what should be published. So as I said, he's been denounced even by the other revisionist historians. He is an outlier. And he can write all the books he wants. He can have all the footnotes he wants. He can have all the citations he wants. You can't trust, I mean, as the old saying goes, you can't trust anything in his books, including and the. Literally.
Yeah, I think Benny Morris says that you need to check his every citation.
Exactly. Even Benny Morris, I shouldn't say even, but Benny Morris, sort of probably the leading revisionist historian, has said he's completely unreliable. You just cannot trust anything he says.
Yeah. Well, another kind of a line of attack was to say, well, loads of academics write articles about the Nakba in peer-reviewed journals. Who the heck is Camera to say that the Nakba's, this narrative is nonsense? Maybe you could say something about academia and, why do academics embrace this storyline?
We're talking mostly about people in Middle East studies, which is a wasteland at this point. I mean, Middle East studies were revolutionized by Edward Said and his, denouncing of the Orientalists. Even though Edward Said was not a historian, he was a professor of English. His book on Orientalism really destroyed the field of Middle East studies. And pretty much everyone, with few exceptions in Middle East studies, now follows along with the Said paradigm in which facts don't matter. What matters is power relations and the alleged, imposition of narratives upon the Middle East by the so-called Orientalist scholars, first and foremost, the late, great Bernard Lewis, but many other great Orientalist scholars who were very sympathetic towards the Arabs, being denounced as, white supremacists, essentially, to use today's terms. It's nonsense. They can, as I said, they can publish all the books they want. Deal with Haifa, deal with Jaffa, deal with the facts. Don't give me made up stuff like Tantura. Again, deal with the facts of what the tape recordings of the interviews actually say. The latest is, there are mass graves of forensic architects are claiming, this crazy group called forensic architects. What architects know about forensics, I have no idea. But this group that calls themselves forensic architects is claiming that they have like drone or something evidence that there were mass graves around Tantura. Well, there were battles there. Wherever there are battles, there are mass graves. It happens, unfortunately. There are mass graves throughout the United States where Civil War battles took place. Nobody is claiming that these soldiers were massacred by the South or by the North. There were large numbers of deaths and there were mass graves. So that's just reality. So even if there are mass graves there, that doesn't say anything about how that happened and who those people are and was there a massacre, right? The two are not causally related.
I guess we have a question here from someone in the audience saying, how do you respond to the charge that Jewish groups like J Street agree with the Nakba charges? So I guess this question is, what do you do with sort of Jewish groups who are pushing this narrative?
Well, I don't know, J Street calls itself Jewish, and they're free to identify as Jewish, I suppose, but who do they represent? And are they any more careful with the facts than Elon Pape or Rashid Khalidi or Walid Khalidi? I would say the answer is no. I mean, they're anti-Israel propagandists at the heart of it. I wouldn't, again, and the. I wouldn't trust and the among anything else they would say. They don't have a reputation for truth telling. So if they are supporting the Nakba narrative against the facts of history, which are very clear, then what does that say about them? I mean, it's self-refuting.
Yeah. So in your article, you mentioned the Palestinian leadership's alliance with Nazi Germany, the Grand Mufti. Some responses were that the Zionists, there were claims that the Zionists were in alliance with the Nazis in the 1930s, flying the flag. There was a few trolls who kept posting these comments. So how do you respond to those?
Zionists were not in league with the Nazis. On the contrary, to the extent that the Zionists had anything to do with the Nazis, which they had to do if you wanted to get Jews out of Germany, which they were desperate to do, who else could you deal with except the Nazi government? After all, at the same time, there was an American ambassador in Germany, in Nazi Germany. There was a British ambassador. There was a French ambassador. There was a Norwegian ambassador. And all of those countries had ambassadors from Nazi Germany as well, as we did, right? This was the time before the outbreak of World War II, when Nazi Germany under Hitler, was represented around the world. And so who else would the Jewish agency or Jewish groups or Jewish freelancers deal with except Nazi officials in order to try to rescue Jews? So, so my answer to that is like, so what? What would you expect?
So I have a question here. How can Jewish organizations go on the offensive against the Nakba narrative? Defensive arguments themselves are futile. What do you think of
Well,
this?
first of all, I agree that we have to go on the offensive, but I would not agree that defensive arguments are futile. And I don't think what I've been doing here is defensive. I think a lot of the Nakba believers would consider it offensive in many ways. But, you know, there's the old saying about, oh, you're just preaching to the choir. Well, I always say, if you don't preach to the choir, you lose the choir, right? This is the great sin that the Jewish community in the United States has engaged in. We've lost the choir. We've lost many of our own young Jewish students. Why? Because we never taught them the facts. We've never taught them the reality. And so they're completely naive when they go to college. They think they believe in morality and justice, and they're presented with the Nakba narrative. They're presented with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem and Haaretz and Elon Pape, etc. And they don't know how to respond, except they think of themselves as good people, and any good person would be against these kinds of massacres and expulsions, etc. So it's an unusual Jewish student with the wherewithal to defend his manner of thinking against this kind of assault. So that's one of the main problems, is you lose the choir if you don't preach to it. So the first thing we have to do is a much better job at preaching to the choir. I would say that in many cases, Jewish day schools and Jewish parents are failing. They're failing to teach their kids how to deal with this sort of thing. I've seen when Jewish students go to college and they complain to their parents and they complain about, what they're faced with, deans will say, well, these kids went to Jewish day school, so they've never heard the other side. They're just hearing the other side here, and it's upsetting them. Well, no, they're hearing falsehoods and lies, and that's what's upsetting them, but they're not really equipped to refute it and to handle it. One student in a class who is willing to stand up can make a big difference. It's not easy, though. Not easy. Not at all easy.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that your article spoke to so many people. It highlighted the fact that the Nakba narrative is a very one-sided narrative. The standard Nakba story makes it appear as though only Palestinians suffered in the 48 war. But your article points out that the Israelis suffered tremendously in the war. And so maybe you could expand a bit more on Israeli suffering at the hands of the Palestinians and Arab armies in that war.
Well, of course. I mean, as I said, Israel lost 1% of its population. That is a huge toll. For instance, in the United States today, if we lost 1% of our population in a war, that would be over 3 million people, 3.3 million people. When have we ever imagined a war that costly? It was a brutal war, fought at very close quarters, in many cases without advanced weapons, so hand-to-hand fighting in some cases, leading to many, many deaths. At the start of the war, the Jews had all of 3 tanks. The Arabs had hundreds of tanks. At the start of the war, the most potent Arab force was the Arab Legion, which was commanded by a British general, Pasha Glubb, or General Sir John Bagot Glubb, a British general with experience from World War II. The top officers up and down the ranks were British veterans of World War II. The Jews had nothing to compare to that. So the fact that Israel was able to survive that war in some ways is miraculous. There is a miracle. Part of the miracle was that the Arabs didn't work together. I mean, had the Arabs worked together, they would have won. But when the Israelis were holding off the Jordanians, the Egyptians held back. Why? Because they didn't trust the Jordanians, and they didn't like the Jordanians, and they were afraid the Jordanians were trying to grab land to the benefit of themselves and against the interest of Egypt. So they held back. And then when the Israelis turned their attention to the Egyptians, Jordanians then held back, very happy to see the Israelis give a black eye and a bloody nose to the Egyptians. So they didn't work together, luckily for Israel. They worked against each other. And that's how Israel was able to survive. Without that, I think the Jews would have lost early on against regular armies. Not the best, but the Arab Legion was quite good, as I said, with British officers. The Jews had some American officers who eventually came over after the first ceasefire, like the Mickey Marcus story, that movie. That's a true story. So there were some American soldiers who came by after the first truce, but still nothing to compare to what the Arabs had on their side. I will mention also that this liaison between the Arabs and the Nazis continued after the war. In the 1956 war, there was a whole division of the Egyptian army called the German Division, which was led by a General Farnbacher, who was a veteran of the Afrika Corps, served under Rommel during World War II, and again had Nazi soldiers who had escaped justice up and down the ranks facing Israel. Now, luckily for Israel, the Egyptians did not allow General Farnbacher to deploy his troops as he wanted to. He was forced to deploy his troops very stupidly right at the frontier, which he knew was a very bad idea, but the Israelis took advantage of that, and he was never a factor, and the German division was never a factor in that fight. The strange thing is that the Israelis learned from the success of the Germans in World War II and how to conduct so-called lightning war. Now, some people try to say, you see, the Israelis learned from the Nazis. Oh, no, actually, the Nazis got their tactics from a British writer named Sir Basil Liddell Hart, who was sort of the founder. He's the one who really pioneered the idea of lightning war, which only the Germans in World War II and later Patton really ever adopted. And so the Israelis didn't learn so much from the Germans. They learned from Basil H. Liddell Hart, who actually was a huge fan of Israel and visited Israel in the 1960s and got a rapturous welcome in Israel, because the Israeli press had written that this was the key to our victories in 48 and 60 and 56, was the strategy of Basil Liddell Hart. So it was said that his reception in Israel was second only to that of Marilyn Monroe at the time.
Wow. We have a lot of comments here addressing the point of the Jewish refugees from the Middle East. Perhaps your own family was involved in that. So maybe you could add something about what happened to the Jews in the Middle East.
Well, there was a population exchange, and that's very, very important. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Arab world, Jews who could trace their family lines to before the Islamic conquest, who were there. Their families were there before the creation of Islam and before the Islamic conquest, the Islamic imperialism, which took Egypt and took other countries and turned them into Islamic Arab countries. After all, Egypt is in Africa. Tunisia, Somalia, these are all African countries. Algeria, these are African countries. How are they Arab? Arabs are from Arabia, right? There was an Islamic conquest, Islamic imperialism. In fact, Ephraim Karsh, whom I mentioned earlier, also wrote a book. He didn't just write a book called The Betrayal of Palestine. He wrote a book called Islamic Imperialism about exactly this, about the Islamic takeover and the Arabization of the Middle East. And so, yes, there were many Jews whose presence in those countries predated the Islamic conquest and who stayed there. Morocco still has a pretty significant Jewish population, but there's a huge number of Moroccans who came to Israel, Moroccan Jews. Egypt had a large Jewish population. And so, but these populations are basically down to nothing now, in Egypt, certainly. So huge number of refugees who were resettled in Israel. One of the articles that I wrote about the apartheid, debunking, basically deconstructing the apartheid myth, I go through some of those facts and show some of the pictures of the Jewish refugee camps in Israel for the refugees that came from the Arab world. And also there was a Jewish refugee camp for the Jews who, as I said, had to leave Jaffa during the fighting. There actually are pictures, which I included, of a Jewish refugee camp from the fighting in Jaffa, plus all the huge number of Jews who came from the Arab world. Those are essentially the poorer Jews. The richer Jews who had connections abroad were able to go elsewhere. Some of them came to America. Some of them went to Europe. Most of them had to come to Israel. No other place was opening its door to those Jewish refugees. So there were at least as many Jewish refugees as there were Palestinian refugees. Israel resettled the Jewish refugees and does not today consider the descendants of those refugees to themselves be refugees. The Palestinians, of course, when they say there are millions of Palestinian refugees, are counting the descendants of refugees. And no other refugee problem considers, or legally is construed, such that descendants of refugees are refugees themselves.
Yeah, we have a question here, in fact, from someone pretty much making that point. This person's asking, isn't the right of return argument made by the activists also a distortion, i.e., it only applied to the original generation?
Well, it didn't even apply to them. The right of return is based on Resolution 194, which is a General Assembly resolution after the war. So it could not establish any legal right at all. It's just a General Assembly resolution. And it said the refugees, it didn't say Arab refugees, refugees should be allowed to return at the earliest practical time, living in peace with their neighbors. I would say virtually none of the Arab refugees were willing to live at peace with their neighbors. Nasser and others clearly said the refugees should return as masters of the country. They should take over the country. They'll outnumber the Jews. So there never was a right of return. In fact, that's why all the Arab countries voted against Resolution 194. They all voted against it because it would mean, voting for it would mean recognizing the existence of Israel. Now, under Resolution 194, there was the establishment of a Palestine Conciliation Commission and a peace talks at Lausanne in Switzerland. And it's very, very interesting. The Israelis went. The Arab countries actually went to the peace talks. Such was the prestige of the new United Nations that they didn't want to simply ignore the UN call for them to come. So they went, but they refused to engage with the Israelis. They refused to talk with the Israelis. The Palestinians, the Palestinian refugees, were very, very concerned that they would get betrayed by the Arabs, because they felt they had been betrayed by the Arabs in 1948. A lot of Palestinians then would say, you told us to leave, we left, and then we couldn't come back because you lost. So a lot of the Palestinians were blaming the Arabs for what happened to them, not the Jews at the time, not the Israelis. And so the Palestinians were very concerned. So it was very, very touching. They took up a collection in the refugee camps to get enough money to send two young Palestinian lawyers to Lausanne to try to represent Palestinian interests. One of them was named Aziz Shahada. He was the father of Raja Shahada, who was still alive, who was himself a lawyer, and the founder of a very, very anti-Israel legal organization called Al-Haq, viciously anti-Israel. But his father was sent to Lausanne to try to represent Palestinian interests. When they arrived, they went to the hotel holding the various Palestinian legations and, various Arab legations, and the Arabs refused to meet with them. In fact, they went to the Egyptian hotel, and the Egyptians said, leave or we'll call the police. The only legation who met with them were the Israelis. Only the Israelis met with the Palestinian representatives. And at Lausanne, Israel offered to take back 100,000 refugees as a goodwill gesture if the Arabs would engage. But the Arabs refused to engage.
Interesting.
So that never happened. Still, through the years, the Israelis, through family unification, have let tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees come back to live in Israel and then to live in the territories after 1967. So
yeah, we have someone here talking about the, I guess, the origins of the word Nakba. Someone here is writing about how it was originally coined by a Syrian intellectual to indicate just the failure of the Arab armies to crush Israel And I suppose,
Yeah, it's Konstantin Zurak. He did write a book like that in which he made that claim. But catastrophe, Nakba, is a pretty common word. So just because he used it in that way doesn't mean that all Palestinians use it in that way. The idea that this is the first person to put it in a book, and somehow that means he owns this narrative of that Nakba narrative, which was that the catastrophe was losing the war. I don't think that matters today. I don't think very many Palestinians know who Konstantin Zurak is. I don't think many Palestinians today. I think no one on college campuses who know about the Nakba has any idea about the original meaning of the Nakba. So I don't really think it's that relevant. I don't think it makes much of an argument to say that there was this book that nobody remembers, published so long ago, which said the catastrophe was losing the war. That was part of the catastrophe, admittedly. Had they not lost the war, there would not have been a Palestinian refugee problem. So I don't think that's that strong an argument. I think a much stronger argument is to deal with the Nakba as it is construed today, and to deconstruct and demolish that narrative, because that is what is spurring so much activity and emotion on college campuses, with these so-called human rights groups, et cetera, with the congressmen, with the Democratic Socialists of America. That's the narrative. Bernie Sanders is not giving space to Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib because of the catastrophe that the Jews weren't massacred in 1948. He says he supports the existence of Israel. So that's not the Nakba he's talking about. So that's why I don't think it's that great an argument.
yeah, a lot of people here are writing in, basically asking, what do we do? Why is it the camera? There aren't too many organizations willing to come out and make a statement like you did about the Nakba. So what needs to be done to push back against this narrative and get these counterfacts you've been talking about?
I think obviously we have to do more. We have to concentrate more on this. We have plans. Let me just put it that way. I don't want to disclose too many of the details, because good ideas often get copied very quickly. So let's just say we have plans that we want to bring to fruition before publicizing them. But I think also it should be noted that the Israeli government needs to do more. Before the Rabin Peres government in the early 90s, there was a Hasbara department in the foreign ministry. Hasbara is the Israeli term for explanation, for getting out the Israeli side of the story. There was a Hasbara department. And because, as Yossi Beilin said, you keep on arguing why we can't make concessions, but we want to make concessions. Yossi Beilin was like the foreign minister then. We want to make concessions. So they got rid of the Hasbara department. They closed it down and fired all of them. There is an excellent book called Myths and Facts, which a subsidiary of AIPAC was publishing then, that goes through a lot of the Palestinian and Arab myths and then has the facts. A very helpful book, a very good book. And the Israeli government pressured AIPAC to stop publishing the book. And so they did. They passed it along to another organization. Actually, Eli Hertz, who later became our chairman, created an organization to keep publishing Myths and Facts. It's since passed into other hands, unfortunately. But that was what the Israeli government did then. I think it was a huge mistake, right? The Israeli government wanted to make peace with the Palestinians. The Palestinians never stopped their anti-Israel propaganda. But the Israelis somehow felt like they had to stop telling the truth about the Palestinian movement. Reminds me of that old joke that Ronald Reagan told when he was involved in one of his campaigns in California. Very vicious campaign. And he said to his opponent, if you stop telling lies about me, I'll stop telling the truth about you, right? So I think that should be the Israeli point of view. If the Palestinians stop telling lies about Israel, then the Israelis would stop telling the truth about the Palestinian national movement. But that was not the tack that they took. They allowed the Palestinians to keep telling lies, and they stopped telling the truth. So the Israeli government, and it's not easy because it's very divided, but the Israeli government has to start once again telling the truth about this and pushing this narrative as well about what really happened in 1948, because it is the key. As Ariel Sharon said when he was prime minister, the war of 1948 never ended for the Palestinians. They just pick it right up again, right? Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc., the Palestinian Authority, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. He realized that's just a continuation of 1948. Some of the same battles that he fought in now see battles as well with terrorists.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good point to end on, Alex. Thank you so much for talking to us, and of course, thank you everyone for joining us. Unfortunately, our time is up, and we have close to 80 questions. So my apologies to those whose questions I couldn't get to. But thank you again, Alex, for this thought-provoking discussion. You've given us much to think about, as your work always does. And again, I want to recommend Dr. Safian's viral article, "The Nakba Narrative is Nonsense," which you can read at camera.org. I also want to say that if what you heard today, or if you feel that Camera in general provides a needed voice in current discussions and debates about Israel and Jews, I hope that you will consider making a donation to our organization. Just go to camera.org and you'll see a big red button there where you can make a gift, which we very much appreciate. Or if you can't make a financial gift at the moment, there are other ways you can contribute. I'd encourage you, for example, to join our media response team. It's our volunteer team of letter writers who protest inaccuracies in the media. Many of the letters to the editor, which you see in major newspapers around the world, are actually from people who are part of our 18,000 strong letter writing team who participate in our many campaigns. We'd like you to be part of it. We want to grow it. If you're already a member, please invite one or two other trusted friends to join. They can quickly sign up by emailing Sarah S. Miller at camera.org. That's SMILLER at camera.org. Sarah will get them quickly signed up to receive our alerts and our action items, which are a powerful way for you to help combat media disinformation. The bigger we are, the more impact we have. So please join or get others to join. But in any case, thank you again for taking time out of your day today to join us. We wish you a good day. And that concludes today's program.